What specifically about agents, forces that third or new category of an identity primitive rather than trying to just jam them into NHIs or service account patterns?
So on top of not necessarily giving you the same answer, they might try to do different things, and that is not what a service account should ever do.
What was the intent of the user or the initial intent given to the agent versus how it's behaving now? Has it drifted? Has it deviated? Is it malicious or is it benign?
If any of those are potentially malicious, it can go completely awry. And it's really kind of understanding, like, what was it created to do, and how did the user prompt it? Did the user actually want to do this? In which case we can kind of hold them accountable.
Starting to understand where you are today is often the first step. Like, what agents are running, what workflows are people trying to use them in.
When you get to that final endpoint, it says, oh, I want to leave the production database, which we've all seen happen. It's like, what?
Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Ian Malloy and Sarah Novotny. Sarah and Ian, thanks for being here.
Happy to join.
Thanks, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you guys. I read this paper that you put out from CoSAI on Agentic IAM, and I ended up reading it, sharing it, and writing an article about it. And so many people were loving the paper and like just the topic in general. It's like one of the hottest topics in cybersecurity. Like, as you guys know, AI and agents, all these things are like the buzz. But IAM in particular, in relation to agentic AI, has been such a hot topic. But before we dive into that, maybe level set of like, what is CoSAI and what is Workstream for? And what is this group of folks that are collaborating on these things?
Sure. So the Coalition for Secure AI is an industry-wide business consortium that pulls together the standard group of people that are very interested in this particular topic. They collected about, almost 22 months ago, just about 2 years ago, and brought together and pulled together a charter saying, we want to look at AI and very specifically how it changes security for technologists. So we have multiple work streams. Workstream 1 looks at the supply chain. Workstream 2 is preparing the defenders. Workstream 4 is looking at compliance and risk management around this. And then we are the fourth workstream, which is focused on agentic AI, which, since this was formed over the last year, has turned into all AI and all of everything. So our working group has been it's been about 9 months that we've been working on this, Ian. Is that about right?
About that, maybe a little bit more. I feel like
Maybe a little more.
we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary at some point.
Everything is a blur in the AI era.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
is true.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the internet era, where you used to talk about internet years like dog years.
Yeah, yeah. So I speaking of CoSAI, there's some other great resources from the other work streams. Like, I think there's a paper either just came out or is coming out around the AI shared responsibility model, right? That I've been taking a look at, and it's a great one because we all are familiar with like the cloud shared responsibility model, and I think we need a new revision of how we think of that with the providers and the labs and things like that around AI. So keep an eye out for that one too. But I kind of want to open the conversation of, talking about like why this group and the paper. Like, traditional IAM, assumes long-lived principles and authenticates once for trust to, per session kind of scenarios. Walk us through the moment for Workstream 4. You guys realized or kind of came to the conclusion that agents generally break this model rather than being another flavor of NHIs, for example, that, organizations have already been kind of wrestling with the last couple of years.
So if you want, I can kind of take this.
Go for it.
I think one of the things I think we realized is, identity and access control is like the primary kind of defense we have in terms of enabling, what agents have access to, what people have access to, what types of resources they can, make any kind of changes. And what we really, really saw is, for the most part, everyone is using like older standard legacy technologies. You're using API keys, you're overprivileging the users. You had this kind of notion where you have, here's an agent, we're all going to talk to it. And because we're all going to talk to it, it has to be able to do anything for any of us. And so we'll just give it super user privileges. And then got really, really shocked when bad things started happening. And so very, very slowly, people started to wake up and like, oh, maybe this isn't how we should do it. Maybe we should look at, proper ways of, provisioning and the agents and giving them their own identities. And we've gone through various little flavors of, personifying them and like calling them employees and trying to put them into, active, different directories and things like that. But for the most part, it was realizing that, their workloads, a lot of the times we consider them, it's like a process that's running. So in many ways, workload and non-human identity is very, very natural. But the changes, it's very non-deterministic. It's almost entirely delegated actions from a user who's interacting with it. They're kind of constantly interacting with these multiple different identity providers and kind of constantly crossing different trust domains, interacting with all sorts of different, systems, different IDPs, things on those lines. And so we realized it was a much more complicated problem to actually solve. And, since it was so core and fundamental, we realized we had to kind of take it on directly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in the paper, it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but you make a pretty strong stance that, like, agents are a distinct identity primitive. Like, it's not a human, it's not a service account. And you talked about this a little bit, Ian, the non-deterministic nature, like the ability to take actions. Like, what specifically about agents, forces that third or new category of an identity primitive, rather than trying to just jam them into NHIs or service account patterns or things like that? Why do they need to be treated as a distinct new identity kind of entity?
I'll jump in and just give the my 2 cents on that one. So from my perspective, it's very much that Ian mentioned the non-determinism, but also the evolutionary nature, because you have agents that are given tasks and outcomes that they're trying to do, and they will take different paths. So on top of not necessarily giving you the same answer, they might try to do different things, and that is not what a service account should ever do, unless of course it's in some sort of terrible state where something is exploiting it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anything
just
to
kind of
add?
add to that, I think we find some of these agents trying to be like overly helpful as well. Where we've had instances where we've gone and we've sandboxed an agent that can't do this following thing, and it says, "No, I want to do that," and it will actually go and probe and be very creative and find ways. Oh, look, I've got this other path. I can just kind of do this directly. And so I think it really is that non-determinism, that power, that agency, I think is typically the way we kind of phrase it. And then kind of trying to understand like one of the big differences, like when I have a workload of a service account, it does this one thing. It's a Rust-based application. I know exactly what it does. I can inspect it. I can statically analyze it and everything. Agents are not like that. You give it natural language, it pulls in anything, and it's constantly changing. And so really kind of understanding how did it come to conclude that this is an action it needs to take. Like that is actually in some ways very critical for determining whether or not you actually want to allow that.
You raise a good several key points, like around the nature of agents. Like, one is that they're I always get the word wrong, psychophantic. Like, they want to please you, right? Like, they want to make you
Yeah.
happy. As a father of five, I sometimes wish my children behaved like agents, but they definitely do not. And then also, like, you can't necessarily in advance know exactly how they're going to move towards that objective or that goal. Like, the behavior is going to look different every time, and it may do things that you hadn't necessarily predicted towards an objective or towards an outcome. And it's given rise of this topic, and I'm sure you guys have probably heard of this within the work stream, of intent, right? Like, what was the intent of the user, or the initial intent given to the agent versus how it's behaving now? Has it drifted? Has it deviated? Is it malicious or is it benign? And like things like that. I'm curious, like, how did the concept of an intent, like, how Ian talked about the way they get towards that goal versus what the goal was or the objective was. How have you guys discussed that within the work stream?
We've touched intent in a couple of spots, but mostly through sort of the least and zero privilege starting point. Because when you give an intent, you want to also bound where that sort of non-deterministic cognitive loop can go. You don't want it to go try to probe, can it get privilege escalation to go do this? So you have to, like, so this again goes to how it has to have its own entity, and then have to have has to have permissions being given, on behalf of, so you can track then where the intent came from, as opposed to itself sometimes, or from someone else. We've run into it in a few other places.
I mean, one of the big things is when you when you see how the agent's actually created. It's a language model that kind of drives everything. It's kind of the brain, and you have really no control over that. I can give it the same prompt two different times. I get two completely different answers. Even if I try to explicitly make it completely deterministic, it'll just naturally give you different responses. And when you kind of combine that with the fact that it's pulling everything, all of its context, all the data it's kind of read, web searches it's done, kind of into its context window. If any of those are potentially malicious, it can go completely awry. And it's really kind of understanding, like, what was it created to do, and how did the user prompt it? Did the user actually want to do this? In which case we can kind of hold them accountable. But if some third party is actually what influenced its behavior, how do you hold, how does that intent kind of flow into it? And I think it's a very difficult thing because we talked about intent and like obligations and access control systems in a lot of ways. And you want to codify them, you want to have like this hard rule, but you don't know. Like I couldn't write a rule that says only employees can access this information if it's for like a good intent. And typically do this through like auditing. So like in healthcare systems, we have break glass. If my intent is to save your life, yeah, great. I want you to allow that. Um, if it's to leak your information, obviously that's something that's very bad. And you kind of hold them accountable kind of post-mortem. It's really difficult to do with agents.
Yeah, this concept of intent, it almost feels like a psychological or a philosophical concept that we're trying to grapple with from a technical perspective, and we just can't make it fit nicely because it's such a squishy concept, and it could mean something to mean something different, right, to different people in a different context. And then to Ian's point, like it can be influenced by things in the context window, things the agents consume. Like Google, I think it was, had a great paper called Agent Traps, like things that it consumes from the web and external sources and all these kind of things. And another strong stance in the paper is, I think it was that it stressed that we should extend the existing IAM as a control plane rather than standing up a parallel agent-only stack. That kind of cuts across, some of a lot of arguably the vendor messaging and honestly maybe to the dismay of some of the venture capitalists backing some of these, agent only IAM solutions. But why did the group land there, and where does the protocols like OAuth and OIDC and PKI, et cetera, maybe run out of road and open the door for like agent auth and some of these emerging protocols, things like that. This is stuff I've talked about Carl McGinnis, if you all haven't chatted with him.
I know Carl, yeah.
It's so incredible on identity. So, but yeah, where does that run out of road? And maybe we need emerging and or new protocols. And why did you recommend leaning into the existing IAM stack, for example?
Well, I think at the top level, you have to lean into the IAM stack because that's what we have today. And in order to get to our golden potential state of you must have this, you should have this, make sure that it's, time-bounded credentials, we can track the on behalf of stuff that that it's all least privilege. You have to start from where we are, which is we've got an IAM stack. We can use service accounts. We can use, we can sort of squint and make these agentic accounts that are part of the existing stack, but then you work your way toward the ideal. And if you just say you have to start from the ideal, that doesn't work. That's just the nature of the adaptation of our companies and our intent, oddly enough, as we talk about this, as we get back to intent for a moment, like intent can also change over time, and intent can be separate from outcomes. So, we have to work through all of this. It's such a fun space because you're right, it is half philosophical, half how the hell do we make this work?
Yeah.
But I think on top of that, we're already using these identity and access management systems to govern the access to those resources in the first place. Like all of that has already been set up. It's very, very difficult to go in and say, you know what, I know you've been giving employees access all the time, but if you want to give an agent access, you need to completely rip that out, throw it out, put something else in place. Like it really doesn't fly that well. Plus, Sarah mentioned you're doing this on behalf of, you're delegating your authority typically to an agent so that it, going back, it has zero privileges on its own. It can't act without you actually kind of delegating some of your authority. And that has to come from the existing IAM systems we actually have.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you both used the next phrase I was going to ask you about, ironically enough, in my questions here is OBO, or on behalf of. The separation of an agent's own rights versus, it's on behalf of rights, with an actor and a subject preserved at every hop. It feels intuitive, right? We need to be doing this, but in practice, how hard is it to keep that delegation chain intact across multi-hop, multi-vendor, multi-agent interactions? And where does that start to kind of fall apart a little bit or become incredibly difficult, at least?
I'm going to give this to Ian.
No, never. Again, I think it's a kind of a problem of like legacy. So like we would love to be able to do, OBO constantly, like for every single hop, actually do a full token exchange, do a proper token exchange, drop privileges and scopes, do rich authorization requests, do depops, so proof of possession in case like that token gets leaked. I think one of the problems is you're not requiring every single step along the way to actually have infrastructure, to have to update it. You need all the endpoints to be able to support it. Not everyone supports all of the OBO flows. Not everyone supports all of the RFCs or understands like those really, really fine-grained permissions we get from rich authorization requests. So that's actually a very, very difficult thing. just to make this truly work end to end with an incredibly large ecosystem. Because you're not, again, we're not clean slate. We're not standing up and having these agents talk to new services. We're having to talk to all the legacy. So one of the things that we tend to be able to do, and I think we talked about this a little bit later, is you start adding like different gateways and proxies that can kind of sit there and intermediate. And there are different open source projects that I've seen that actually will start taking care of some of this for you. So if you go and you deploy within like a Kubernetes, there are sidecars you can kind of install, which will take care of some of these different exchanges for you. But again, like once you start crossing these boundaries or talking to legacy systems, that's where things start to break down a little bit. And that's where I think some of the initial friction that we're trying to kind of engineer around is going to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to ask you all kind of on that note about the friction, maybe a couple practical questions about implementation and adoption of the principles, like in the document. It has a good amount of like musts and shoulds. If I'm an identity architect listening to the conversation now or reading this paper, what is genuinely deployable right now with kind of off the shelf tooling, and what still depends on the standards and the products, kind of evolving and so on. Like, what are some practical steps that people can do right now versus, the ecosystem needs to catch up a little bit around some of these evolutions?
I think you're starting with the tools you have and the scoping you have. So one of the things that is really challenging about this is trying to our point about intent, figure out what the agent is trying to do, intending to do, tasked to do, etc., is one way to look at this, but also looking at it from the flip side of what is the security of that level of that data. How privileged is that data? Being able to look at it from that reversed perspective is one of the things we can do today with the tools that we have to some extent, is being able to sort of constrain it that way as we're building in the more specific tools and building in the new tools and the new frames. And I'm sure that Ian will be able to frame this with more specific good suggestions for today.
One of the differences kind of goes back to like, what is it that you're having this interact with and talk with, and does it actually support all these different flows? But we've done a couple of like really interesting experiments where, again, we have like an old legacy system that doesn't necessarily support this, but you can kind of put in some bit of like a proxy or a gateway that kind of fronts it, and so that kind of like you layer your security there. So using a sidecar, you can kind of force it. Everything has to go through these different points. You can leverage the natural native capabilities, whatever platform you have, as much as possible. Again, if you're like deploying to some of these like, native AI platforms, some of them might have built-in capabilities you can start leveraging. Depending upon who your identity provider is, you can kind of see which flows they already support, and you can start like leveraging the tools capabilities you already have. You control the application, you can start setting up your own scopes and permissions specific to those scopes, make sure they're least privilege. If your agent only needs read access, don't give it write access, that type of thing. So you can kind of start down scoping things. You can get, somewhat fine grained. And then one of the other things that we've been kind of doing and advocating for is you can start layering on, in addition to whatever your identity provider is, you can start throwing in like an OPA or a CEDAR as a policy that can understand attributes and get very, very fine grained, to the point where we've done ones which look at exactly all the parameters of the command you're executing and have a policy there that you can enforce and say, you know what, I know you could, in theory, do this with all of your capabilities, but we're kind of doing this like, it's not necessarily deep packet inspection, but looking at the payload and all the parameters of the tools, and are now going to start like forcing further limits onto what it can actually do. So even with like legacy, there's some very, very creative ways you can start layering on with gateways and meshes and sidecars and then kind of pushing, different identity providers and different, service providers to start supporting more of the RFCs.
Yeah, I love a few points you raised there. I kind of work in this space myself, and the concept of leveraging like policy as code, right? You talked about Sarah brought up the reasoning loop earlier. You want to kind of step outside of that, to your point earlier, Ian, to kind of implement what's been the industry's kind of calling hard boundaries, right? Where you've kind of implemented these hard boundaries from a policy as code perspective that you can limit architecturally, environmentally, what the agent can do with a policy as code approach, and that's kind of catching on. So I think that some of these primitives of how we secure these agents are starting to kind of mature a bit. Another aspect of the paper I really like is you kind of lay out, not trying to boil the ocean. Like you lay out this three-phased path, from visibility to contextual access for agentic IAM. And you flag that, phase 3 is automated discovery, and what it kind of helps prevent regression. For an organization just starting out, what does a credible phase 1 look like? And I know it may look different for every organization, but what are some of the common ways that you anticipate some folks may stall or run into some hardships of moving from, phase one towards phase three as they go about trying to do this.
Starting to understand where you are today is often the first step. Like what agents are running, what workflows are people trying to use them in, what data is being accessed by that, and what are the sort of security concerns about that data. Like just understanding what you have today is always the starting point. And that's, for a lot of people, that's a big lift right now. We talked, many years ago about shadow IT. We've got shadow AI all over the place at the moment, large scale and small scale companies at this point. So I think
Anything to
that's
add
your
on that
starting
one?
point. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like the visibility, the understanding, the environmental or organizational awareness, right, is like, and being honest with yourself about where you are too
Mm-hmm.
is key. Anything to add on that, Ian, just before I go to the next question in terms of, how you see folks going from phase one to phase three and some of the
Yeah,
pitfalls or things to keep in mind along the way there?
definitely. I think what Sarah said is right. Understanding where your agents are, and I think most companies would be quite surprised. A lot of the times they're like, oh, like we can look at our cloud providers, we can actually hook in there, and we'll see what agents you actually deployed. What they fail to realize is it's probably significantly worse than that. Like the number of agents people probably have running personally on laptops and virtual machines and Docker images that might not be fully visible, especially when you start having like open clause, start like popping up left, right, and center because people thought, hey, this is a really, really fun technology. Now you're randomly giving it access to everything, and even sanctioned agents internally. I think a lot of organizations just don't necessarily see that. So figuring out and discovering where it is, and then having that observability, like the full logging, the telemetry data, sending it to your SIM, monitoring it, knowing when things kind of are going to go awry, when you're going to have some form of an incident, being able to then kind of respond very adequately, revoke credentials, so that you have that auditability and accountability that's there. So even if you don't have the controls, knowing what is going on, like that is probably one of the biggest things that people should be doing as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think I'll probably butcher this, but knowing is half the battle, or some kind of quote like that. It's like, yeah, you can't protect what you can't see, and all these kind of catchphrases that we have in security. It's so foundational. And to Ian's point, like, this is the fastest growing technological paradigm I've ever lived in, and arguably ever, like, based on some of the numbers out there and stuff. And the cloud is just the one of the many environments where agents are. You have endpoint coding agents, agentic browser, these personal AI assistants, SaaS embedded agents. Like, you likely have far more agents than you know, and they're likely doing a lot more potentially risky activities than you would like them to be doing.
In a
Maybe
total
the question.
micro in oh sorry in a
Go
total
ahead.
microcosm, I'm now starting to run with on my Mac little snitch to make sure that I'm watching what every connection is going out, and I have my activity monitor up all the time when I'm doing things just so I can watch. I
Yeah.
mean, it's tinily, it's like totally a microcosm. It's not corporate big, but like that might be the best practices for the foreseeable.
Yeah, we're actually getting into this point where we want to run, like, every agent should be running a sandbox that has strong isolation. You don't give it access to any of your credentials necessarily. It doesn't have access to the network except for the three resources, and then you start layering on the
Yeah.
like use case specific security controls.
Yeah, definitely. I've had a couple guests, just shout out to them, Alex from Adara, and then Luke Hines of No No, if you
Hmm.
all are familiar with No
I
No,
know, Luke.
on
Yeah.
the show in the past, and kind of went way down the rabbit hole of sandboxes, which is
Hmm.
a whole nother thing. But it's again becoming one of these primitives around securing agents, or at least a defense in depth kind of approach of securing agents or mitigating the risk of agents. Sarah, I wanted to ask you this one, maybe from the community's perspective. Like, there's a lot of parallel work going on in the community. Like, you have the OWASP NHI Top 10. CSA has agentic AI guidance and frameworks. Obviously, we talked about the different identity protocols, and some new, some old, that are being modernized. How do you see the paper kind of fitting alongside some of those efforts, and how should practitioners think about like the overlap, among the ecosystem, and kind of, because it can be overwhelming. Like, well, CSA and OWASP and CoSAI, and like, where do I get started? There's so much. Like, how do you think of that?
We think of it definitely as an ecosystem, and in a space where we're trying to work aware of what other organizations are doing and in a complementary context to them. So OWASP is going to give you a top 10. We're trying to give you sort of big picture but tactical directional research guidance. We're also trying to give sort of proof of concept tools. We're working more on this in the moment, proof of concept tools, so that you can see how these recommendations might be implemented. We're seeing I'm not going to get all of the names right because they all sound so similar to me, but like the AI Alliance is working on the different, the way the different models are built and secured long term, and we make sure that we're very much working as a piece of an ecosystem, and trying not to duplicate things, but also trying to build upon the work that has already been done in order to move an organization forward when they do read our work, or point them to the next phase in someone else's work.
Makes sense. And I'll say this is one of the more comprehensive and detailed papers I've seen on this topic yet. I think it's why it resonates so well. Like when I read it, when I shared it with my network. Last question for you all. Like what should folks keep an eye out next for from Workstream 4? What are some things that you're working on? And also, if folks want to get involved, how can they get involved?
Ooh, I'll field this first or the second one first. How about that? So if you want to get involved, we're working on moving our work to be more GitHub first. So you can find our GitHub repository under the Coalition for Secure AI, and then Workstream 4. That can all be linked off of the Coalition for Secure AI webpage, and we can get you links to put in whatever content you add to this. So we're working on that. We have a process where we put forward RFCs for next topics that are being worked on, and those RFCs are sort of surfaced two ways. One, from the group of volunteers that work with us, like what are their pain points, what are they seeing, what are they having to work on and being really interested in within their company. And then also from the sort of leadership perspective of what does the technical steering committee feel is what the industry is going toward, that we might not have an expert in at the moment, but we really need to find a way to address. And so from those two directions, we have different work efforts that are happening. And we have, let's see if I can get these right, agentic authorization is one of them right now. We have a work stream on the agentic development lifecycle. So if you are building something that is going to have some autonomy, how does that differ from a traditional software development lifecycle? And then how would you want to run those things as well? That's sort of a maybe a little bit out of scope. We're still trying to figure out the scope on that one. We're also doing an update to our first model context protocol security paper, and that we're looking to put out in the next 2 months. And then there's one more piece of work that I'm not thinking of. Do you remember it? Now I'm putting you on the spot, Ian.
We had the trust aware data plane.
Trust aware data plane, yep.
And trust graphs. So
yep.
Some of this gets into, as Sarah mentioned, with the ADLC, the development lifecycle. You've got kind of the how do you develop, onboard, govern, and so on your agents. We've got the agent credentials. How you give them necessary privileges, fine-grained privileges, delegating them, and then you have potentially some of the like more runtime enforcement, access control, contextual. Different policies actually want to be placing upon these, and then how you can kind of drive that. So this notion of the trust graph that the community is starting to propose would be, here's all the provenance information about how the agent actually came to make a decision. Because when you get to that final endpoint, it says, oh, I want to delete the production database, which we've all seen happen. It's like, well, what possessed you to want to do that? And if you had all the information of the original prompt and everything is kind of pulled in and its reasoning process, at the end you could figure out like, oh yes, the user explicitly asked me to do this, versus no, it completely hallucinated type of thing.
Yeah, so, it all comes to full circle. We saw that happen with Pocket OS, where the system prompt had specific instructions, right? And the agent's like, you know what? I don't know why I did that. Like I shouldn't have done that. And that's where I think we back to the policy as code and the hard boundaries and the environmental controls and stuff like that. So safe to say, like you guys have a lot of work ahead of you. You're doing some amazing work already on these different initiatives and papers. And folks who want to get involved, I'll be sharing some links in the show notes that Sarah mentioned here. So Sarah and Ian, thanks so much for jumping on. And really that paper just resonated well with me and the rest of the community. So thank you so much.
So glad it was helpful.
Thanks, great.
Take care.
Thanks.